The splintered wood of the door frame bit into her shoulder as the lock plate gave way. Rain, cold and relentless, immediately soaked the back of her worn flannel shirt. Rowan, 17 years old and holding the weight of her life in a single military surplus backpack, did not look back. Behind her, the voice of her stepfather, Frank, was a ragged, beer-fueled engine of fury, spitting curses that were swallowed by the rising wind. In her left hand, she gripped the frayed leash of Finn, a German shepherd mix whose low growl was the only protest offered. He stood his ground for a moment, a silent, furry bastion of loyalty, before her gentle tug pulled him out into the night. The yellow light from the kitchen spilled onto the gravel driveway, illuminating the churning mud and the beginning of the darkness that would consume them. Frank's final words, a slurred declaration of her worthlessness, were cut off by the violent slam of the front door. Then there was only the sound of the storm and the frantic, hammering beat of her own heart. She had to build a world for them, or they would be erased by this one. The backpack was heavy, packed not with clothes, but with a desperate, curated collection of tools she had been stashing for months: a small hatchet, a pry bar, a full box of waterproof matches, a roll of duct tape, and a heavy canvas tarp. Each item was a silent admission that she knew this day was coming. Her hands were numb, the cold seeping through her thin gloves. Finn whined softly, pressing his wet body against her leg, a warm anchor in the freezing deluge. The road was a river of mud, but she didn't follow it. To follow the road was to be found. Instead, she turned towards the black wall of the state forest that bordered the property, a place Frank never went. The trees were a dense, dripping curtain, and stepping through them was like stepping off the edge of the known world. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep behind them. Every gust of wind through the pines sounded like a shouted name. But there was nothing. Only the escalating violence of the storm and the cold, hard reality of their situation. They were alone, with less than $100 in her pocket and a storm that the radio had promised would bring the first deep freeze of the season. Rowan pulled the hood of her jacket tighter, the fabric already heavy with water. She looked down at Finn, his intelligent eyes fixed on her face, waiting for a command, for a sign that she knew what she was doing. She didn't. But she would not let him see it. She would not let him feel her fear. The forest floor was a treacherous soup of mud and decaying leaves. Each step was a battle against the sucking grip of the earth. The rain had found its way through every layer of her clothing, and a deep, bone-aching chill had taken root in her core. Rowan's world had shrunk to the next 10 feet of impenetrable darkness, illuminated only by the weak, bouncing beam of her small headlamp. The batteries were already dying. Finn stayed close, his body a solid, reassuring presence against her leg, his panting breath a small engine of life in the suffocating wet. They couldn't stop. To stop moving was to let the cold win. She pushed deeper, using the incline of the ridge as her guide, hoping to put as much distance and difficult terrain as possible between them and the house. The initial adrenaline had long since burned away, replaced by a dull, throbbing exhaustion. Doubt, a cold and insidious whisper, began to creep into her thoughts. This was impossible. The forest was too big, the night was too cold, and she was just a girl who had stolen a handful of tools. But then she would feel Finn's wet nose nudge her hand, a silent, urgent message: keep going. He was depending on her. That single, simple fact was the only fuel she had left. After what felt like hours, climbing over moss-slicked logs and pushing through thickets of thorny brush, Finn suddenly stopped. He lifted his head, his ears erect, and a low, inquisitive rumble started in his chest. He tugged at the leash, pulling her not forward, but sideways, toward a massive rock outcropping that loomed like a petrified wave in the darkness. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice a raw croak. He didn't respond, just pulled harder, his powerful legs churning through the mud. He led her to the base of the rock face, a sheer wall of granite slick with rain and draped in a thick, ancient curtain of ivy. He began to whine, pawing at the dense foliage, digging at the soft earth beneath it. Rowan shone her failing light on the spot. At first, she saw nothing but rock and leaves. But then, a flicker of something unnatural. A straight line. A perfect, man-made edge hidden beneath the chaos of nature. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in her chest. she dropped to her knees, ignoring the biting cold of the mud, and began tearing at the ivy with her bare hands. The vines were thick as her wrist, but she pulled and ripped, her movements frantic. Underneath, she found them. Weathered grey planks of wood, nailed horizontally across a dark, narrow fissure in the rock. It was a door. A sealed, forgotten entrance to somewhere dry. The pry bar was cold and heavy in her trembling hands. The wood of the makeshift door was swollen with years of damp, the nail heads rusted into deep brown stains. Finn stood back, whining softly, his body coiled with a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. Rowan wedged the flat end of the pry bar into the seam between the top plank and the granite. She put her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood was fused to the rock, a stubborn seal against the world. She grunted, repositioning her feet in the slick mud and pushing again, a raw, desperate sound tearing from her throat. There was a groan of stressed wood, a high-pitched shriek of tortured metal as a nail began to pull free. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She worked her way down the plank, levering and pulling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain was a constant, hammering presence, but she barely felt it anymore. Her focus was absolute, narrowed to the small war she was waging against the wood and the rust. Finally, with a loud crack that echoed in the small clearing, the top plank snapped in two. The opening was small, but it was enough. A wave of air, cool but utterly dry and smelling of dust and stone, washed over her face. It was the scent of sanctuary. She tore at the remaining planks, her earlier precision replaced by a frenzied urgency. They splintered and broke, until she had created an opening just large enough to crawl through. She clicked off her dying headlamp to save the last of its power, plunging them into absolute blackness. "Okay, boy. In," she commanded, her voice barely a whisper. Finn needed no second command. He scrambled through the opening, his claws scrabbling on stone. Rowan pushed the backpack in after him and then wriggled through herself, scraping her back on a splintered piece of wood. Inside, the world changed. The roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain vanished, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The air was still and cold, but it was a dry cold, a manageable cold. She was out of the storm. She fumbled in her pocket for the box of waterproof matches. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, but she managed to strike one. The tiny flame erupted, a fragile star in the immense darkness. The light flickered across the walls of a small, natural cave. It was no more than 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide, the floor a smooth, packed earth. It was empty. Utterly, beautifully empty. The match burned down to her fingertips, and she dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. She didn't light another. She didn't need to. She crawled to the back of the small chamber, pulled Finn close, and wrapped the canvas tarp around them both. The dog rested his heavy head on her lap, and for the first time in hours, a long, shuddering sigh of relief escaped her lips. They were safe. It was fragile, temporary, and uncertain. But for now, it was enough. The first light of dawn was a weak, grey suggestion filtering through the broken entrance. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and brutally cold. Rowan woke stiff and sore, but alive. Finn was already awake, his tail giving a few tentative thumps against the dirt floor. The immediate, life-or-death panic had subsided, replaced by the grim calculus of long-term survival. This cave was a shelter, but it was not a home. Not yet. She ate a cold, stale granola bar from her pack, sharing a piece with Finn, and took stock. The first priority was securing the entrance. The broken planks were a liability, an advertisement of their presence. She spent the morning carefully removing the remaining boards and pulling the ancient nails, salvaging every piece of wood. She hid the splintered pieces under a nearby fallen log and coaxed the ivy back over the opening, creating a natural curtain that, from a distance, looked undisturbed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. With the entrance concealed, she allowed herself to explore their new refuge more thoroughly. She lit a single match and used it to light a small candle from her pack, the flame creating a small, dancing pool of light. The main chamber was simple, but at the very back, almost hidden in the shadows, she saw a darker patch, a continuation of the space. A narrow passage, just wide enough for her to squeeze through, led deeper into the rock. A knot of fear and curiosity tightened in her stomach. She held the candle forward and stepped into the passage. It opened into a second, larger chamber, this one bearing the clear signs of previous human habitation. A primitive fire pit, little more than a circle of blackened stones, sat in the center. On the far wall, someone had carved a set of initials into the rock, JD, and a date, 1987. She ran her fingers over the crude letters. She wasn't the first person to find this place. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. As she turned to leave the inner chamber, a sound from outside froze her in place. A man's voice, loud and coarse, followed by the sharp crack of a breaking branch. She immediately extinguished the candle, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the entrance, her movement silent, and peered through a tiny gap in the ivy. A man stood not 50 yards away, his back to her. He was dressed in worn camouflage, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He knelt and pulled something from the undergrowth, a rabbit, caught in a wire snare. A poacher. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and swift. Then he stood, scanning the woods around him, his eyes lingering on the rock face. Rowan held her breath. His gaze swept over her hiding place, paused for a heartbeat, and then moved on. He seemed to sense nothing, his attention drawn by the call of a distant bird. He shouldered his rifle, the dead rabbit swinging from his belt, and walked away, disappearing into the dense trees. Rowan sank back against the cold stone wall, her legs trembling. The world outside was not empty. It was not a wilderness. It was someone else's territory. And they had just trespassed. The near discovery by the poacher, Harlan, changed everything. The cave was no longer a simple refuge, it was a fortress that needed to be invisible. The fear he had instilled in her was a cold, motivating force. She knew she couldn't risk a fire in the open pit, the smoke would be a beacon. She couldn't risk making noise. She had to go deeper, not just for safety, but for resources. The second chamber, with its old fire pit and carved initials, felt like a dead end, but something about the back wall seemed wrong. It was a chaotic jumble of smaller rocks and packed earth, unlike the solid granite of the other walls. It looked like a collapse, but the angles were too deliberate, the placement of the larger stones too structured. It looked like it had been stacked. An idea, wild and improbable, took root in her mind. She retrieved the pry bar from her pack. She started with a smaller rock near the bottom, wedging the tool into a crevice and levering it out. It was heavy, but it came loose, revealing more packed earth and the edge of another stone behind it. For hours, she worked in the dim, flickering candlelight, her body aching, her hands raw. She pulled away rocks and clawed at the dense, clay-like soil, creating a growing pile of debris on the chamber floor. Finn watched her, a silent, patient observer, occasionally nudging her with his nose as if to offer encouragement. Finally, the pry bar hit something that wasn't rock. It made a hollow, resonant thud. Wood. Her heart leaped. She dug faster, her fingers bleeding, until she had cleared enough earth to reveal the corner of a large, green wooden crate. It was military surplus, with faded white stenciling on the side. This was no collapse. This was a cache. A deliberate, hidden supply dump. It took another hour to clear enough space to pull the first crate out. The lid was nailed shut. She used the pry bar again, the screech of nails echoing in the confined space. The lid popped open. The smell of canvas, oil, and dried goods filled the air. Inside, neatly packed, were wool blankets, a small cast iron skillet, and dozens of tin cans, beans, salted meat, peaches. It was a treasure hoard. Behind the first crate were two more. The second held tools, a collapsible shovel, a bow saw with extra blades, a sharpening stone, a heavy-duty first aid kit, and, at the bottom, a gleaming, well-oiled pickaxe. The third crate was the most astonishing. It contained boxes of ammunition, a cleaning kit, and, wrapped in an oilskin cloth, a beautiful, lever-action Marlin rifle. Rowan lifted it, the weight of the steel and wood solid and serious in her hands. She had never fired a gun before, but she understood its meaning instantly. It was power. It was a voice that could speak to men like the poacher. This wasn't just survival. This was a chance. The man who carved a JD's on the wall hadn't just stayed here, he had prepared. He had left a legacy, a blueprint for survival, waiting in the dark for someone desperate enough to find it. With tools and resources, Rowan's entire posture changed. The fear remained, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with a layer of fierce, determined purpose. She was no longer a refugee hiding from the world, she was an architect, building her own. Her first project was fire. The open pit was too dangerous. She remembered reading about a type of fire pit used by pioneers, one that hid the flame and smoke. A Dakota fire hole. Using the new pickaxe and shovel, she began to dig into the packed earth floor of the main chamber, near the side wall. The work was brutal. The ground was dense, interwoven with ancient roots and rock. But the rhythmic strike of the pickaxe, the scrape of the shovel, became a kind of meditation. She dug 2 pits, a foot apart. The first was the fire chamber, wider and deeper. The second was the air intake, narrower and angled to connect to the base of the first pit underground. She then used the pickaxe to carefully carve a narrow flue from the top of the fire chamber up through the rock and soil of the cave wall, directing it to a fissure hidden on the surface among a thicket of bushes. It was painstaking, exhausting work. By the time she was done, her body was screaming with fatigue, but when she lit a small, controlled fire of dry twigs in the pit, the result was magic. The flame burned hot and bright, drawing air through the intake tunnel. The smoke, instead of filling the cave, was pulled cleanly up the hidden flue and dispersed invisibly into the dense woods outside. For the first time, she had heat without advertising her location. She could cook. She could be warm. Next, she turned her attention to the entrance. The ivy curtain was not enough. Using the bow saw, she hiked a quarter-mile from the cave and found a fallen pine, its wood seasoned and dry. She spent 2 days sawing the trunk into rough planks, then hauling them back to the cave one by one. She built a frame inside the entrance, anchored to the rock itself, and then fitted the planks into it, creating a solid, thick wooden door. She fashioned a heavy crossbar from a piece of oak and carved brackets into the rock to hold it. From the outside, the ivy still concealed everything. From the inside, it was a fortress gate. She organized the supplies from the crates, lining the cans up on a natural rock shelf. The blankets made a warm, dry bed. The skillet, sizzling over the Dakota hole with a can of salted meat, filled the cave with the first smells of a real home. Each completed task, each small victory of engineering and effort, was a brick laid in the foundation of her new self. The girl who had been thrown out into the rain was being replaced by a woman who could command fire and stone and steel. Finn seemed to sense the change, his quiet presence now imbued with a kind of canine contentment. He would sleep by the fire, his body relaxed, secure in the warmth and safety she had carved out of the mountain. The delicate ecosystem of her hidden life was bound to be disturbed. She had grown more confident, but not careless. She only foraged for firewood and fresh water at dawn and dusk, when the light was poor and the woods were quiet. But one evening, as she was gathering fallen branches near a stream, a twig snapped behind her. She froze, her hand hovering over a piece of birch. Harlan, the poacher, stepped out from behind a thicket of rhododendron. He wasn't holding his rifle, his hands were empty, but his eyes were hard and assessing. "Thought I smelled wood smoke up here," he said, his voice a low growl. "Been wondering." "Trap's been coming up empty." Rowan's heart hammered, but she forced her body to remain still. She slowly straightened up, not turning her back to him. She said nothing. Her silence seemed to agitate him. "This is my ridge," he said, taking a step closer. "My family's hunted this land for 100 years. Don't take kindly to squatters." He was trying to intimidate her, using his size and his presumed authority to scare her off. The old Rowan would have flinched, would have run. This Rowan stood her ground. "I'm not bothering your traps," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The calmness of it seemed to surprise him. "You're living up here," he accused, gesturing vaguely toward the rock face. "A kid like you." Alone he took another step. "You got something I might want in that little hidey hole of yours." That was the line. The threat was no longer implied. She saw the predatory gleam in his eyes, the calculation. He saw a vulnerable girl, a potential opportunity. She slowly, deliberately, reached behind her back and unslung the Marlin rifle she now carried with her whenever she left the cave. She didn't raise it. She didn't point it at him. She just held it across her body, her hand resting near the lever action. The weight of it, the simple fact of it, changed the air between them. His eyes locked onto the gun, and his swagger evaporated. The rifle was old, but it was clean, cared for. It spoke a language he understood perfectly. "This is my place now," she said, her voice holding the same quiet, unshakable tone. "You'll keep to your side of the stream." "I'll keep to mine." For a long moment, he just stared, his mind working. He was a bully and an opportunist, not a killer. He weighed the risk versus the potential reward and found the math wanting. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Crazy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He slowly backed away, his hands held slightly up, showing they were empty. "You keep your place. But you make trouble for me, I'll make trouble for you." He turned and melted back into the woods, his retreat as silent as his approach. Rowan stood there for a full minute, the heavy rifle a solid weight in her arms, listening to the sound of her own breathing. She had not been a victim. She had drawn a border and defended it. Frank's world was shrinking. The day after he threw Rowan out, he was fired from his job at the lumber mill for drinking on the site. His carefully constructed facade of the hard-working family man was crumbling, and with every piece that fell away, his rage grew, seeking a target. He spent his days at a dingy bar on the edge of town, nursing cheap whiskey and railing against the world that had wronged him. In his mind, all of his problems started and ended with Rowan. She was the source of his misfortune, the ungrateful brat who had brought chaos to his life. His self-pity was a bottomless, corrosive pit. One afternoon, Harlan the poacher came into the same bar, stomping snow from his boots. He was in a foul mood, complaining loudly to the bartender about a crazy squatter girl with a deer rifle who had claimed his ridge. Frank, sitting at the end of the bar, went still. A girl? A rifle? On the mountain behind his own property. The pieces clicked together in his alcohol-soaked brain. It had to be her. Where else would she go? And a rifle? The thought filled him with a possessive fury. She had something that should have been his. The idea began to fester. He saw her not as a survivor, but as a thief, hoarding resources. He imagined she had food, maybe money. He convinced himself that going up there and bringing her back was his duty, a righteous act. The bartender, a weary man named Dave who had seen this kind of spiral before, watched Frank with growing concern. "You should just let the sheriff handle it, Frank," Dave said quietly. "It's getting cold out. Let them bring her in." But Frank wasn't listening. He saw a chance to reclaim his power, to put the world back in its proper order with him at the top. As he stumbled out of the bar, the first heavy flakes of a forecasted blizzard began to fall, thick and wet. He ignored them. He climbed into his rusted pickup truck, the engine turning over with a protesting groan, and pointed it toward the mountain. The bartender watched him go, then picked up the phone and dialed the county sheriff's department. He didn't say what he suspected, only that Frank was drunk, angry, and heading up the old logging road in a bad storm, talking about his stepdaughter. It was enough. As Frank's truck skidded and fishtailed its way up the mountain, a sense of grim purpose settled over him. He was going to find her? He was going to take back what was his. The falling snow was a white curtain, erasing the world behind him, leaving only the path ahead and the rage that drove him forward. The blizzard hit with a sudden, shocking ferocity. The world outside the cave dissolved into a howling vortex of white. Rowan had felt the storm coming, the pressure dropping, the air growing heavy and still. She had spent the day securing her home, bringing in a massive pile of firewood, checking the seal on her door, ensuring the smoke from her fire hole was dissipating into the gale. Inside, the cave was an island of warmth and security. The fire in the Dakota hole burned steadily, its heat radiating from the stones. Finn was curled up on the wool blankets, sleeping soundly. For the first time since she'd been cast out, Rowan felt something approaching peace. She was warm, fed, and safe. The fortress she had built with her own 2 hands was holding against the worst the world could throw at it. She was reading a water-damaged paperback she'd found in one of the crates when the sound came. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the outer door, nearly lost in the roar of the wind. Finn's head shot up, a deep growl vibrating in his chest. Rowan's blood went cold. Harlan? No, he was too smart to be out in this. Then a voice, slurred and distorted by the wind and rage, cut through the storm. I know you're in there. Open this door. Frank. Her past had followed her. It was pounding on the gate to her future. Terror, stark and primal, seized her. He had found her. The one person she could not reason with, could not intimidate. She scrambled to the door, her hand shaking, and dropped the heavy oak crossbar into its stone brackets. The thud of the bar seating was a solid, reassuring sound. You think you can hide from me, he roared, his voice a muffled bellow. You stole from me. That's my place. My stuff. Another series of heavy blows shook the door in its frame. Finn was on his feet now, barking, his body planted between Rowan and the entrance. Rowan grabbed the rifle, her hand slick with sweat. She chambered around, the metallic shick-shack of the lever action a sharp, definitive statement in the small space. Go away, Frank, she yelled, her voice thin but clear. There's nothing for you here. The hell there isn't, he screamed back. A new sound began, a sharp, splintering crack. He was using something to attack the door. A tool from his truck. A tire iron, maybe. Splinters of wood flew from the inside of the door. But the planks were thick, the frame solid. Her engineering was holding. She stood in the center of the cave, the rifle held ready, listening to the desperate, violent assault. He was a storm raging against a mountain. He could batter it, but he could not break it. The minutes stretched into an eternity, marked only by the rhythm of his attack and the howling of the wind. He cursed and screamed, his voice growing hoarser, his blows becoming weaker, more erratic. The cold was getting to him. The rage was burning his energy, and the blizzard was draining his heat. The pounding slowed, then stopped. She heard a heavy, slumping sound against the outside of the door. Then, nothing but the wind. He was still out there, a silent, freezing menace. The siege wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more terrifying phase. The silence from outside was more unnerving than the assault. Rowan remained frozen in place, the rifle at her shoulder, aimed at a door she could not see past. The wind shrieked, a constant, high-pitched keen that seemed to be mourning the violence that had just occurred. Finn stood beside her, utterly still, the fur on his back ridged, his low growl a constant, guttural hum. Every gust of wind that rattled the plank sounded like Frank stirring, preparing for another attack. Rowan crept to the wall beside the door, where she had drilled a tiny peephole, just wide enough to see through. She pressed her eye to the cold stone. The world outside was an impressionist's nightmare of swirling white. She could see almost nothing. But she could make out a dark shape, a slump of blackened denim half buried in a rapidly growing snowdrift against the base of her door. He hadn't left. He had collapsed. A new kind of fear, colder and more complicated, settled in her stomach. He was dying on her doorstep. The thought was horrifying, but the alternative, opening the door to the man who had tormented her, who had just tried to break his way in, was impossible. It could be a trick. A ploy to get her to lower her guard. She backed away from the door, her resolve hardening. She had not invited him here. She had not created this situation. She had built this place to be safe from him, and it had worked. Her responsibility ended at the edge of the stone she had carved and the wood she had sawn. She would not open the door. She spent the rest of the night sitting with her back against the far wall, the rifle across her lap, watching the entrance. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. Finn never left her side. She listened to the blizzard rage, the storm inside her slowly quieting as the storm outside spent its fury. She was not the scared girl who had run into the forest. She was the woman who had held the fortress. Sometime before dawn, the wind began to die down. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that only comes after a great storm when the world is buried under a thick blanket of sound-dampening snow. She had outlasted him. She had outlasted the storm. The first rays of morning light pierced through her peephole, impossibly bright, reflecting off the pristine snow. She looked through it again. The shape was still there, a mound in the snow, no longer distinguishable as a human form. She felt a pang of something, not grief, not pity, but a profound and weary sadness. It was over. The warmth from her fire, the life she had sustained, was on one side of the door. The cold, and the end of a bitter, broken man, was on the other. A line had been drawn, and she was on the side of the living. Then, a new sound. The distant, grinding churn of a heavy vehicle working its way up the mountain, its tires fitted with snow chains. Someone else was coming. The sound of the engine grew closer, then stopped. A car door slammed shut. Muffled voices carried on the still, cold air. Rowan stayed positioned by her peephole, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw two figures in dark uniforms, their forms stark against the blinding white of the snow. Police? They moved slowly, cautiously, towards Frank's half-buried pickup truck, then began following the single set of tracks leading through the deep snow. The tracks led directly to her door. Deputy Miller saw the mound in the snow first. She knelt, brushing away the fresh powder to reveal the collar of a denim jacket, then the pale, frost-rimed face of a man. She checked for a pulse. It was there, but faint, thready. Got him, she called to her partner. He's alive. Barely. Get the medics up here now. As her partner relayed the call, Miller's attention was drawn to the door itself. It was a masterful piece of work, set flush against the rock, the planks thick and solid. There were deep gouges in the wood, evidence of a frantic, failed assault. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a fortification. Who had built this? She stood and knocked, her knuckles rapping against the cold wood. County Sheriff, she announced, her voice firm. We know you're in there. We're here to help. Please open the door inside. Rowan took a deep, shaky breath. She looked at Finn, who looked back at her, his tail giving a single, uncertain wag. It was time. She laid the rifle down, her hands no longer shaking. She walked to the door and lifted the heavy oak crossbar. The bar was heavy, a solid, reassuring weight. She had made it. She had survived. With a deep groan of wood on stone, she pulled the heavy door inward. The two worlds met. The cold, sterile air of the blizzard-swept mountain rushed in, and a plume of warm, life-filled air from the cave billowed out to meet it. Deputy Miller, expecting a scared, half-frozen runaway, was stunned into silence. Before her stood a 17-year-old girl, not shivering, but composed. Her clothes were worn, but she was clean and healthy. Behind her, a dog stood calmly at her side. And beyond them, Miller could see the interior of the cave, illuminated by the warm, steady glow of a controlled, smokeless fire. She saw stacked firewood, neatly organized shelves of food, wool blankets folded on a raised sleeping platform, and tools hanging from pegs driven into the rock. It wasn't a shelter. It was a home. A marvel of engineering and will, built in secret, in the heart of the mountain. Miller's professional gaze softened into something else entirely. Awe. She looked from the half-dead man in the snow to the young woman who had built a world to protect herself from him. My God, kid, she breathed, the words turning to vapor in the cold air. What have you done here? Rowan didn't answer with words. She simply stood in the doorway of the home she had built, the warm air she had created flowing out around her, a silent testament to the fact that she had not just survived. She had prevailed.